The studio lights flickered slightly as the show went live, and tension was already in the air. Viewers were expecting a routine panel discussion, but what they got instead was an electric shock to the political system. As the host barely finished introducing the guests, Karoline Leavitt leaned into her microphone, eyes locked on both Robert De Niro and Representative Jasmine Crockett. Her voice, sharp and unwavering, cut through the polite pleasantries. "You know what," she began, pausing only long enough for the silence to become uncomfortable. "I've had enough of the hypocrisy, let's talk facts." The temperature in the room dropped, and De Niro turned slowly, his face tightening. Crockett raised an eyebrow, sensing what was coming, but unsure just how far Leavitt was prepared to go. Leavitt didn't wait. She pointed directly at De Niro, her tone laced with both contempt and confidence. "You sit there, lecturing Americans on morality while working with an industry that glorifies violence, disrespects law enforcement, and profits off division. How can you sit here and act like some moral authority?" The host attempted to step in, stammering slightly, trying to pivot, but Leavitt didn't break stride. "And you," she turned her gaze to Crockett, "talk about representation, but what you're really doing is pushing division in the name of progress." The audience sat in stunned silence, some jaws literally dropping, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The control room scrambled to decide whether to cut to commercial or ride the wave. Karoline continued, unbothered, "Let's be honest, the American people are tired of being talked down to by elites who think they're untouchable. You might have applause here in the studio, but out there, out in the real world, people are sick of your double standards." The fire in her delivery was undeniable. Crockett crossed her arms, smirking slightly as if waiting for her turn to strike back, while De Niro merely narrowed his eyes, refusing to blink. It wasn't just a confrontation, it was a full-on detonation, right there on live television. The internet would explode within minutes, but for now, all anyone could do was watch as Karoline Leavitt turned the calm stage into a battlefield of words. As Karoline Leavitt's opening salvo settled over the studio like a storm cloud, Robert De Niro sat back in his chair, blinking slowly, absorbing the sting of her accusations. His lips tightened, his fingers tapping softly against the armrest in a slow, deliberate rhythm. For a moment, it seemed he might let the comments slide, but then he leaned forward, resting both elbows on the desk, eyes locked on Karoline. "You come on this show with fire, that's clear," he said, his voice low but steady, laced with equal parts frustration and incredulity. "But yelling the loudest doesn't make you the most honest." The host glanced nervously between them, unsure if he should step in, but De Niro wasn't waiting for permission. "You want to lecture me about moral authority?" he asked, his expression growing more serious. "I've spent decades speaking out against fascism, against corruption, against leaders who poison the democratic process. If that offends you, maybe you should look at what offends you, not me." The audience responded with a slight shift, murmurs of support mixed with tension. De Niro raised one hand, palm up, as if making a point in a private conversation. "You throw around headlines and cherry-picked quotes. That's not debate, that's a social media tantrum dressed up in a blazer." Karoline didn't flinch, but De Niro wasn't done. "You speak as if you're some revolutionary truth-teller, but let's be real, what you're doing is stirring anger. You're not trying to unite anyone. You're trying to score points with people who already agree with you." He leaned closer, his voice growing firmer. "You accuse others of elitism while doing everything you can to become a media celebrity. If that's not hypocrisy, I don't know what is." The room tensed. The host adjusted his microphone, the camera operators subtly zooming in to capture every flicker of expression. "You want to know why people are tired?" De Niro said. "They're tired of the shouting. They're tired of people using truth like a weapon instead of a bridge." He looked over at Jasmine Crockett briefly, then back to Karoline. "You want to fight for America? Try listening as much as you talk." He leaned back, folding his arms, as the tension hung in the air like static before a thunderclap. The instant Karoline finished her fiery accusations, Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, her expression shifting from composed amusement to simmering defiance. She let out a slight chuckle, but it wasn't one of humor, it was the kind that carried disbelief, even contempt. "Karoline," she began, drawing out the name like a warning, "if you think throwing around flashy accusations makes you the voice of reason, think again." Her voice was firm, polished from years of public speaking, but this time it was laced with fire. "You walk in here thinking you've got some exclusive access to truth, when all you're really doing is recycling talking points that light up social media for 5 minutes and fade when people ask for substance." The audience stirred as Jasmine's tone sharpened. She pointed slightly, not with aggression but assertion. You come after me, questioning my integrity, my representation, without even acknowledging the communities I fight for, the policies I push, and the inequality I confront daily. You call it manipulation, I call it reality. The room, already buzzing from Karoline's opening salvo, now crackled with growing tension. Jasmine wasn't backing down, she was meeting fire with fire. You want to talk about division? She continued. Let's talk about the people stoking it, people who show up on shows like this not to have a dialogue but to perform. You're not interested in bridging anything. You want a viral moment. Karoline sat still, a slight smirk on her face, clearly unfazed, but Crockett wasn't finished. What's tiring, she said, gesturing to the camera, is this constant need to turn serious policy into drama for clicks. While you're here swinging at shadows, real Americans are trying to keep their homes, their jobs, and their dignity. The host attempted to moderate the rising tension, but neither woman was interested in retreat. Jasmine's eyes didn't waver. You don't scare me with your confidence, Karoline. You provoke, but you don't persuade. And that's the difference between spotlight and service. The room erupted, not in applause, but in sheer, stunned silence. Karoline didn't flinch. As Jasmine's final words echoed through the studio, she calmly reached beneath the desk and pulled out a manila folder, thick and worn at the edges. She placed it deliberately on the table, the thump of its weight making even the host lean in with curiosity. You want substance? Karoline asked, her voice cooler now, more calculated. Let's go there. She opened the folder and slid out a stack of printed headlines, reports, and screenshots. Holding one up to the camera, she read aloud, De Niro says Trump supporters don't belong in America. That's not unity, that's arrogance. She slapped it down on the table, making papers scatter slightly. Before anyone could respond, she held up another. Crockett calls criticism of her policies rooted in white fragility. That's not leadership, that's blame shifting. Her hands moved quickly, one headline after another, each accompanied by a brief commentary. These aren't cherry-picked. These are your words, your tone, your record. The host, clearly struggling to maintain control of the segment, shifted in his seat, but Karoline ignored him. Her voice grew more intense, each phrase delivered like a hammer. You both talk about Americans like they're ignorant. Like they need you to tell them how to think, how to vote, how to feel. De Niro's face hardened, his mouth opening as if to protest, but Karoline didn't slow down. You think passion is bullying, and disagreement is extremism. No, it's patriotism. It's having the guts to say the emperor has no clothes. She looked straight into the camera. People watching this at home, this is what they're tired of. People in power pretending they care while dismissing everyone who doesn't applaud them. The audience was quiet, not because they weren't moved, but because they weren't sure what would happen next. Even Crockett had stopped preparing a retort, sensing this moment belonged entirely to Karoline. She placed her hands flat on the table. I didn't come here with a script. I came with facts, and if either of you has the courage, let's talk about those, not the soundbites, not the outrage. The truth. The silence was deafening. The tension that had been simmering throughout the segment now pulsed like electricity through the studio. The host glanced around, visibly uneasy, clearly trying to regain control of the moment, but neither Karoline nor her opponents were ready to let go. Sensing that the conversation had reached a boiling point, he finally interjected. Let's all just take a breath, he said cautiously, attempting to inject calm. I think what we're seeing here is passion on all sides, and maybe, just maybe, we can find some common ground. But the words barely landed before Karoline leaned forward again, her tone cooler now, not aggressive, but hauntingly resolute. There's a reason Americans are tuning out of politics and tuning into debates like this, she said, her voice calm, precise. It's not because they love drama. It's because this is the only time they get to see someone push back on the narrative that's been dominating every major institution, every channel, every voice for years. She gestured toward De Niro and Crockett, not with disdain, but with a clarity that demanded attention. You both represent a status quo that many people believe has failed them. You dismiss their values, ignore their struggles, and shame their opinions. The host nodded slightly, trying to keep the peace, but it was Jasmine who broke the quiet. And maybe, she said carefully, they're tired of being misled by people who pretend to represent them, only to climb the political ladder themselves. Her voice had lost its heat. This wasn't an attack anymore. This was vulnerability, layered over guarded pride. De Niro followed with a measured sigh. We don't have to agree, he said softly, but we do need to stop pretending that shouting louder means you care more. There was a pause, brief, but powerful. Karoline looked at them both, her intensity softening for the first time. If either of you is willing to step outside the bubble and meet the people I've met, the ones you rarely hear from but who live with the consequences of every bad policy and broken promise, I'll take you there myself. Her offer wasn't sarcastic, it was serious, honest, and for a flicker of a second, something changed. Not consensus, not surrender, but recognition. The fight had ended, not with a winner, but with a fracture exposed and acknowledged on live television.